1. In 2017, I was in Northern Ireland for a college field trip. My religious studies class was visiting stone circles throughout Northern Ireland and Ireland to focus on religious geography. On this particular day, I think we were visiting the Beagmore stone circles. It was a normal cloudy day, and we were enjoying learning the history of the Bronze Age wonder, excitedly waiting to go back to the hotel to begin a new day of pub-hopping. I remember the stone circles being separated from the nearby woods with a small wire fence. For some reason, we were hanging out around the fence, peering at the woods that lay not 20 yards away. We had yet to go into any woods during our trip, staying mainly at the sites surrounded by farmland. I remember wanting very much to go into this old wood. For whatever reason, we all seemed to feel curious about it. I decided to climb over the old small farm wire fence and see if there was anything interesting in the woods. Now these woods were different than the woods I was used to in North America. The branches were thick, too thick to stand in. I had to bend at the waist to traverse them. The ground was covered in a soft light brown moss broken up by tree roots. I remember quickly moving under the branches, staring at the ground as not to trip. I felt giddy, like I was a child going somewhere my parents told me not to. I felt light and I began to pick up speed. I suddenly looked up to make sure I wasn't about to run into a tree trunk, when something made me stop in my tracks. I saw legs, human legs. I could only see their legs, like someone was standing straight up in the trees. The branches were too thick to stand in, but this person's legs were the only thing visible. I felt an almost animal response of fear that didn't really make sense. I told myself they couldn't see me because I could not see their face. But for some reason I felt that they knew I was there. Why would someone be out there? We were the only group at the circles, and there were no houses nearby. I looked behind me and realized I was much further in the woods than I had thought. I could barely see the light from the place I entered. It was so quiet. They had to have heard me approach. My only thought was, I am much closer to them than I am to the entrance. They could get me before I make it out. I was only standing there, bent over for no more than a minute, but it felt like forever. I didn't see them move, but I could tell they were facing toward me, not away. I now really felt like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. Only this time, instead of giddy, I felt nauseous. As if I was a deer and they a hunter, I turned and bolted. I flew through those trees, still bent to avoid collision. I didn't look down this time, stumbling as fast as I could, just focused on the light at the end of the trees. I felt branches pull my hair and clothes as I ran. I couldn't hear anything over my own breathing. As soon as I broke the tree line, I felt a weight lift. The group standing at the fence looked startled by me bursting out of the woods. I told them that I think I saw someone, but it almost felt wrong to talk about it. Well, soon after, I don't know what I think it was. Was it a person hanging out deep in the forest? Was it a fae, a spirit, the green man? All I know is that it felt otherworldly. 2. I had just got to a friend's house to hang out for a bit. We talked in his garden for a while before moving inside. His dog was extremely excited to see me. He always runs around and won't sit down for a second when somebody different comes to the house, jumping up and demanding attention. We had a coffee in his dining room near where we came in before moving through to his lounge, with the dog following us, of course. His lounge was quiet, and all you could hear was the sound of a fridge a short distance away in the kitchen. Upon entering the room, I suddenly got a massive shiver down my spine and said that it felt colder in here than the rest of the house. My friend gave a generic answer, trying to find a reason for why that was the case. I then got another massive shiver down my back and noticed the dog had suddenly become less hyper, more focused and quiet. Mainly, he was staring directly at the door handle. I thought nothing of the shivers or the dog's unusual behavior in the moment, but I think subconsciously I clocked something was up. My friend turned on the TV and we watched something for a minute or two before I heard a loudish mechanical sound, which at first I thought was the fridge in the kitchen. I turned towards the source of the sound, which was the door, then turned back to the TV. Suddenly I realized what I had saw and turned my head back to the door to realize the door handle was slowly being pushed down. And that was the sound. It wasn't a fridge making sounds, it was the creaking of the door handle being pushed down. I watched it slowly go down for 2 seconds before I turned to my friend in shock, to see him watching it too in complete shock, knowing nobody else was in the house. The dog was sat watching it in silence the whole time. My friend suddenly jumped up and as quick as he could opened the door. From this point I don't recall seeing anything at the door from the angle of being next to it, but he claims to have saw a jacket move back towards a coat rack as if it had reached out to open the door. This friend had his eyes play tricks on him before, so I'm not sure how much I believe his part of the story. But I know we're both reacting to the same thing. I tried the door handle after, and it required a lot of resistance in order to open it, and my friend said that has never happened before. He then proceeded to tell me the previous owner of the house had died there, and together, we worked out the last room in the house not to have changed decor is the living room. I was meant to stay over that night, but was pretty freaked out and ended up walking home. My friends seemed to dismiss what happened as a way of coping. All thoughts and questions welcome. 3. There was a house in my area that burnt down several years ago, when I was still a child and living in my old house. There are no reported deaths, but I beg to differ. When I was around 12 years old, and whilst the house was still relatively fresh from the fire, me and a friend decided to go inside and explore it for whatever reason. There was an unlocked window which we climbed through, and although my memory is a bit hazy, I do remember the staircase being black and ashen, the walls and ceiling ripping apart, etc. I also remember walking into a room which looked like a child's room. There was a framed picture of 2 girls, some family photos and whatnot. Me and my friend left soon after. The house got remodeled, and frankly, I forgot about it. Cue a few years later, me and my family moved from our old small house into a new 2-story house in our area that we still live in to this day. And you guessed it, it's the same house that burnt down. Now, things were fine for a few years. I didn't experience anything weird. That, however, changed around 2 years ago, when I began seeing and hearing things mainly in my room and occasionally around the house as well. It started off with voices, especially when I would be going to sleep. I have no history of any mental health issues, so this was a new occurrence for me. I'd be laying on my side trying to go to sleep, and I would hear a woman's voice singing into my ear. She would sing, whisper unintelligible things, sometimes speak to me, but I could never make out anything she was saying. It was the most surreal thing ever because it would be as though she was right next to me or above me. But every time I'd turn around to see who's there, nobody would be. This then escalated to hearing voices of 2 girls. It wouldn't be in my ear as before, and rather around the entire room. They would sing kid songs, rhymes, etc. I then began hearing constant knocking on my door, and the floor creaking in my room as though someone was walking around. I even called out a few times to see if anyone was there. I'd ask my sister if she was at my door, and she'd always say no. This went on for a while before I actually began to see her. Not the kids, but the woman. I'd see her all the time, and they'd always be split-second glances and she would disappear. She would be in the creepiest places and positions too. A lot of the time I'd see her in the corners of the ceiling in my room right above my bed, on all fours and clutching onto the ceiling. I saw her like this as I walked past my sister's room as well. I'd see her walking down the stairs, head down, hand on the rail. Sometimes she would stand in my room and just look at me. Again, I would only ever see her for a second at most, but it's so vivid in my memory. Weird thing is, she never scared me. Sure, the knocking and voices freaked me out at first, but when I began actually seeing her, there was no fear at all. It was quite calming, actually. I'd try to talk to her sometimes too. She'd obviously never respond. Nowadays, I haven't seen her much. The kids' chants have gone, but I still occasionally hear whispering or humming into my ear when I'm about to sleep. I moved rooms as well, so maybe that's why. Sometimes I do end up sleeping in my old room, and those are the nights where I hear her the most. My cat, however, still stares at the door and the ceiling, and at an empty spot in my room. Sometimes she hisses. Sometimes she just meows. I've told my mum my experience and my sister. Both haven't seen or heard her specifically, but they both believe me and think something is wrong with the house. 4. I am completely skeptical of the paranormal, but my girlfriend is a firm believer. Some background information. My girlfriend lives with her mother, while her little sister, who is 8, lives with her grandmother. Also, her family comes from a pagan background, and her granny used to be in a cult. My girlfriend used to live with her grandmother before moving back in with her mother, and used to stay in the room that her little sister now stays in. She was with her grandmother for 13 plus years, but while she was staying there, she had a few unexplainable things happen to her. Her dead grandpa appeared to her at the bottom of her bed. When he was alive, he was a very happy, outgoing, caring man, but when he appeared to her at the bottom of the bed, he seemed very angry, and he said, "It's okay, let go," multiple times. She closed her eyes to try and sleep and pretend he wasn't there, but when she peeked them open, he was gone. Whenever her and her friend used a Ouija board in her room, the board told them to turn off the light and shut her eyes. She turned off the lights, but she refused to shut her eyes, and books proceeded to violently fall off her bookshelf. Her head was forcefully pushed into and held under water in the bath, nearly to the point of death, when no one else was in the house. Her granny, who was extremely religious, started praying one day in her room because she felt something evil, and as she was praying, her metal makeup box started shaking violently. A dark figure appeared at the bottom of her bed and lunged at her, but when it lunged at her, it disappeared when she closed her eyes. The phone rings at around 9 o'clock every year on the anniversary of her grandpa's death. All the aforementioned happened before I met her. Now I will talk about all the things I have witnessed or heard from her family myself. Now here's a part I actually witnessed firsthand, and this could be completely unrelated, but we were watching a documentary on Richard Ramirez and making jokes about him when I was staying over at my girlfriend's house for Valentine's this year. And in the middle of the night, I felt something tickle my feet when my girlfriend was nowhere near me on the bed. And I asked her if it was her, but she pinky promised it wasn't her. And on top of that, my girlfriend also woke up with scratches all over her back. And they were bright red, as if they were fresh, but both of us had been asleep for hours. Also, her handbags that hang over the end of her bed began rattling violently. I doubt this has anything to do with Richard Ramirez, and probably pure coincidence, but the fact that this shit happened in the first place is still scary as fuck, considering I've had nothing unexplainable happen to me my entire life. Then she moved back in with her mother about 2 months ago, and hasn't experienced anything since she moved back in. Her little sister stays in her old room now. Her mother was having her birthday party last week, and my girlfriend's aunt was there. While she was drunk, she told us about her experience where my girlfriend's grandpa appeared to her aunt in her dreams saying, "It's okay, I'll try my best to fight, but I'm unsure if I can win." And whenever she woke up, she heard something being dragged loudly upstairs, accompanied by even louder screaming for help. And she saw her very young son being dragged up the stairs while he held onto the stairs for his life. Whenever they went into his room, they found hoof prints, like a horse, on the wall. I know that part sounds a bit stupid. She told us about her son weirdly staring at the living room wall, repeatedly saying, "That man doesn't like you." Then her TV suddenly fell off the wall and smashed on the ground. After that, she instantly packed and left that house. While she was drunk, we asked if there were any other scary stories, so we could know about, and she said to my girlfriend, "Do you know about your granny?" To which my girlfriend said she has no clue what she's on about. Her aunt said it wasn't her place to say. But we were curious, so we began to pressure her, and she told us that my girlfriend's granny's soul was offered to the devil when she was a newborn by her pagan family, and whenever she is in a church, she can speak in tongues. We left it at that, but then the next day we asked my girlfriend's mom about it, and she confirmed that it was true. My girlfriend was shaken up by this, but I still had my doubts. We visited her granny for Easter last weekend, and we were talking to her little sister about her new room and if she likes it, and to quote her exact words, "It's pretty cool, but I wonder what keeps tickling my feet in the middle of the night." We never told her little sister anything, so the fact that she experienced the exact same thing as me is so fucked up. Then we asked her if anything has happened since my girlfriend left, and she told us about a dream her granny had where she was being chased by a demon around a church. Now, without context, we would have just passed this off as a weird nightmare, but the fact we've been told that her soul was offered to the devil makes this so much more fucked up. Keep in mind her sister obviously doesn't know about the whole devil thing. A smaller thing is that her little sister always complains that her new room is always cold. Her granny apparently used to be a Satanist before her husband died, but then after he died, she joined a coven. Recently she's become a strict Christian, and we believe that's to try and cope with the devil thing. She also refuses to tell my girlfriend about why she stopped practicing witchcraft, saying she'll take it to the grave, implying something bad happened there. I think I mentioned everything. Please let me know what you all think of this, because I don't know how to process it. 5. I used to work as a guide and then as backup, and even as a field director for several wilderness therapy programs for troubled kids in Arizona, Utah, and Idaho. They were all good groups, but where I worked in Utah was in the West Desert south of Dugway. It's possibly the ugliest and creepiest part of Utah. Tons of sketchy stuff happened to us out there. This story happened in 2005. The groups were camped in a really nice area for that part of the desert, called Indian Canyon. This spot was so nice, in fact, that in the late 1800s or early 1900s, some enterprising pioneer family had built themselves a little homestead, with a one-room cabin and a small barn and a cedar pole fence around the perimeter of the little farm. All of that, of course, now was a crumbling, rotten ruin. The cabin, it seemed, had burned down well over 50 years ago, and what remained of the barn was poking out of the grass in 2 or 3 foot shards of grey wood, scattered all over the near vicinity. This week I was also camped in Indian Canyon, but further down the road. I was manning the Infield Emergency Response Vehicle, or the ERV, better known as backup. A new position I helped invent when I took a list of things that had gone wrong in the field to the directors, and explained that because of the horrible response time and the spotty satellite phone service, the only reason we weren't shut down or that people weren't dead was because we were lucky, not because we were prepared or efficient at responding to emergencies. Now, we had radios and someone listening to them 24/7, never more than a few minutes away with a vehicle. That's how it worked, in theory anyway. One of the boys' groups was camped at the mouth of the canyon in the foothills about 2 miles away from me, the other just a mile beyond them. The girls were close too. I was camped somewhere in the middle of the canyon on top of a small ridge that had a little jeep track side road branching off of the main dirt road running up the canyon. And the girls were just a couple of ridges over, maybe a mile away. Though to drive to them, I'd have to go back out to the main road and take a different jeep trail up to their spot, maybe a 5-mile trip. I was about 1.5 miles below the staff training group that was being headed up to my wife Jessica, divorced now. There were going to be several groups of parents coming out to visit their kids later in the week, so both the boys' groups and the girls' groups, all on that side of the mountain, had all elected to stay put for a few days and work on building backpacks and gathering fire sets, and a lot of other primitive skills. The training group had been in the field for almost a week, and they were getting ready to split up and go join the student groups for the last several days of their training. This left me with less to do than normal. I didn't have to find new sites for groups or drop anyone's water or food. Everyone was well taken care of, and no one was moving for several days. I decided to build a sweat lodge next to the creek up near where the new staff were camped. I found the perfect spot well out of sight of the group on a little smooth sandbar right by the water. I got to work. I harvested some long willow saplings that were bendable enough to weave a frame with, and arranged them in a 10-foot circle, digging down 1.5 feet for each one to anchor it in the sand. I bent them into a dome 4 foot high, and I had a structure that I probably could have stood on without breaking it. I walked down to the truck, which I had hidden in some pine trees a quarter of a mile away, and hauled a large bin of tarps and cowhides and plastic sheeting, along with my fire set and some other gear up to my lodge. As I was walking back to the creek, I remember feeling like someone was following me, but when I stopped and looked, I couldn't see or hear anything. It was a beautiful day for July. The morning had started out with some high, wispy cloud cover, but had long since burned off, and the noon sun was high overhead. It wasn't yet too hot, however. I was high enough in the mountains that the oppressive heat that I knew was slowly baking the kids' groups in the desert below wouldn't reach me for another couple of hours. I set to work placing hides first on my little domed frame. I covered those with some tarps and plastic sheeting, and secured it all so that I had as close to an airtight and waterproof shelter as possible, with only a small arched opening for a door. I secured an old military poncho over the door, so that once hot rocks had been placed inside, it could be sealed shut, and the sweat ceremony could take place. I wanted it as hot as possible. There wouldn't be any children involved in this one, so we could go as hot as we wanted. I took the extra time around the base of the lodge to bury all the edges of the coverings deep in sand. This was as sturdy a shelter structure as I had ever built. It was nice. I spent a good hour gathering sage and juniper, and covered the floor of the lodge with a thick padding of the fragrant plants. I did this in part so that it was a soft place to sit for an extended time, but mostly I did it because I was intending to invite the new staff down to do a sweat ceremony later, to help some of them prepare to meet actual students for the first time. And frankly, a group of unwashed men and women who hadn't showered in a week in July, all crammed inside a sweltering homemade dome tent sweating buckets, is a smell that should not be endured without as much sage and juniper as possible. If it was really bad, which it was unlikely to be, I would rub some of it into my shirt and then pull it over my nose and breathe through that. I went hunting for lava rock. I found an outcropping of small rounded boulders perfect for heating on a bonfire, and then rolling into the lodge. And I proceeded to gather 3 onto a tarp. It was heavy, almost too much for me to sling over my back and carry, but I managed to make it back to the fire pit I had dug with all 3. I left them there and went to gather more. I made this a smaller load because it's not like I was in a hurry. I could take more trips. When I got back to the fire pit, one of my rocks was gone. I just stared at the small depression in the sand where I had placed it minutes before, and then looked around for signs that someone, possibly one of the staff from the group, had come and taken it. No tracks. I looked around again like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone in the trees. I walked over and retrieved my stone, the heaviest one I had carried, and put it back with the others. Maybe it had rolled there, through the flat, soft, dry sand. I gathered a bunch more rocks, and none of them went missing, and then I built a fire. As I worked, that weird feeling of being watched came back, only this time it felt more ominous, like it was mad at me for being there. I stood up, determined to walk out in the woods and find whoever it was. The radio, which I kept on and strapped to my belt, had been silent all day, but it suddenly crackled to life. Brian and the boys group doing evening check-in a little early, so that they could do their day hike without having to stop and contact me. After we talked, I felt more normal again. I cooked some rice and beans for dinner, and as they cooled off, I piled my stones, probably 30 of them, into a cairn in the center of the fire, and then just piled on all the dry wood and brush I could gather. I took my knife out of my sheath because that feeling was back, still worse this time. As soon as the fire became almost impossibly big, I saw someone moving fast enough through the trees straight towards me. I tensed and relaxed. Will, a seasoned staff working the training group with Jessica and Katie, came running down the creek. He stopped when he saw me in my sweat lodge and my 10-foot-tall flames, and broke into a huge grin. I thought it was a wildfire. Some of the new girls are panicking. Nope, just an epic sweat lodge, I said. I was planning on inviting you all down for it when you called in, but I'll consider this your check-in. If you guys want to, you're all invited to come sweat. It'll be ready in about half an hour. Perfect, he said. "They're just finishing up dinner. I'll go get Katie and Jess now, and we'll be down." He turned to walk away. "Hey, Will." He turned back around. "Did you guys lose track of any of the new guys today? Or did one of you three come down this way?" He thought for a moment and said, "No, I don't think so. Why?" "It's nothing. I just thought someone might have come looking for me when I was out gathering rocks. Some of my stuff was in a different place than I remember leaving it, is all." He looked at me with an odd expression. "Weird," he said finally. "I'll ask everyone, but we've got pretty busy today, so I don't know when anyone would have come down this far." "It's okay," I said. "Don't stress it. I was just wondering." "See you in a few minutes." The other two kids' groups radioed me shortly after Will walked off. It was more like an hour before the staff group finally trudged into my little sandy clearing. Some of them looked excited, and some of them looked confused at my dome of plastic and sand, and at my pile of glowing red boulders on the still blazing fire, and at the stack of blue 5-gallon water jugs I hauled down from the truck for the experience. "We thought we were going to die in a forest fire," one of the new girls, Carol Sue, said accusingly. She looked extra smelly. I pulled some essential oils out of my possibles bag. A possibles bag is just a type of leather purse we make on the trail that we call possibles bags, to disguise the fact that we are in fact grown men who carry around purses. Put some of this on your wrists and neck. It will keep you in a good frame of mind in the sweat. How many of you have done this before? A handful of them raised their hands. Inside the circle of the lodge is a sacred place. We will do 4 sessions, going longer and longer each time. We will dedicate each session to a different part of our lives, our histories, our families, our struggles, and our choices. Try to only speak from the heart about these things. It will be very hot once we begin pouring water on the rocks, and the heat will make it very difficult to speak anyway, so only speak if it's important." Katie and Will were already rolling the superheated rocks into the lodge, using some long willow poles I had made. I gave Jess a side hug. The trainees didn't know we were married, and we'd found it best not to let kids or people new to the wilderness know, because it could become a distraction from the experience if they got too caught up in our personal lives. So, side hug was all. As far as they knew, we were just co-workers. I took out a dried sage smudge and lit it on fire and did the ritual smoke cleansing for each of them as they'd entered the hallowed ground. I made the last-minute decision not to go into the sweat lodge. That last boys' group had a student that was a little bit of trouble, and I was worried I would end up having to take an emergency radio call about a runner in the middle of someone's heartfelt speaking about their issues with their family or their past. Also the smell. Also, something just felt off. This was a perfect spot and a perfect time for a sweat lodge ceremony, but it felt, not wrong exactly, but off somehow. Instead, I whispered my choice, and that maybe I'd join the next session to Katie, as she was the last to enter. And I sealed the door up behind them, burying the edge of the poncho in the sand, like the rest of the construction. I stood by the fire for a minute or two and felt hot, so I walked in the water down the narrow stream about 100 yards, and just looked at the stars that were slowly becoming more and more visible in the darkening twilight. I stood there for at least 10 minutes enjoying the changing sky. I heard a twig snap somewhere to my left, and the crickets were silent. There was definitely somebody away up there in the trees. I stared hard and could not at first see anyone, but there was a small dark shadow under a pine 30 or 40 feet away. Too dark for this early in the evening. Was that a girl in the shadow? It looked like a small Native American girl with 2 long braids and some kind of headband. I called out to her, but she didn't move. She seemed to be glaring at me, and the longer I stood there, the worse I felt, like the warmth from the air around me was being sucked away. So I took a deep breath and did what I always do in the woods when something unknown scares me. I ran at it. Whoever was there took off fast, and I chased them. I lost them quickly enough. I'm not a runner. But I was sure they had been headed in the direction away from my little creekside sweat lodge. I must have gone 1/8 of a mile, almost to the road, when I heard all of the staff at the sweat lodge scream behind me. My blood ran cold, and I turned on my heel and sprinted back up the canyon. I almost missed the sweat lodge clearing when I came to it because nothing I saw made sense. The fire was out, not even a glow. The sweat lodge was gone. The tarps had all been pulled and ripped up, and they and the hides were flung out in a wide circle on the ground, in the bushes and in the water. The frame was uprooted, and folded over on its side to one side of the sandbar, and all the new and experienced staff were sitting stunned in a circle on a padding of sage and juniper around a pile of rocks. "What happened?" I yelled as I ran up. After a moment, Katie answered, "We were just sitting here and starting to pour water on the rocks to heat things up, and we started talking a little about what it means to know your personal history. The walls of the sweat lodge started shaking, and we thought you were outside trying to get in. It stopped for a minute, and Jess called your name, but you didn't answer. And we had just poured some water on the rocks when the whole lodge went cold, like really cold. And it sounded like a massive windstorm blew in and ripped the whole thing off of us, frame and all, and threw it into the trees. I don't know what to do, so I grabbed my bag and got out every flashlight I had. We started them checking each other for injuries. I lied to them through my teeth and told them it was a microburst windstorm, and they happen sometimes in Utah, and that they were lucky no one got hurt, and so on. And amidst skeptical looks from the three who knew me, I got Jessica and Will to start taking the stunned newbies back to camp. But Katie stayed. Katie had been with me through so many other unexplainable things out there, knew what I was doing. She could tell I wasn't saying something. Fire is out, like it's cold out, and it was 1,000 degrees 20 minutes ago, and the rocks that were glowing hot 20 minutes ago feel like they've been sitting in the creek, she said. What are you not saying, Dan? I took a deep breath. I just tried to chase down a little Native American girl who can run unnaturally fast in the dark. Katie sat down hard. I looked at her, but she didn't say anything, so I continued. Today, while I was gathering rocks for the lodge, I felt someone was watching me the whole time. And I swear I'm not making this up. But I set down that really big rock, the first one you rolled into the circle, and I walked away for a few minutes, and when I returned, it was over by the creek, like someone came in and moved it, but there were no tracks, and it couldn't have rolled there. Then after you all went into the sweat lodge, I walked down the creek and heard something in the trees. It took me a minute to spot her, but she was hiding in a shadow under a tree. I think I chased her for about 30 seconds when you all started screaming, and I ran back up here. What Katie said next made me sit down too. Did she have 2 braids and a headband? I nodded slowly. Early this morning, like 3 in the morning early, Jessica woke everybody up and said it was going to rain and that we needed to build a shelter. There were no clouds last night, I said. I know, said Katie. But she woke us all up and insisted that we needed to build a shelter and wouldn't drop it until we all moved closer together and put up some tarps. I'd like to see the stars if I wake up, so I moved in close just in case, but I didn't get under a tarp. Neither did Will or Josh. He's one of the new guys. Well, this morning, just before it got light, I had a really disturbing dream where I felt like I was awake in my sleeping bag and was staring up into the tree above me. And there was this little native girl with 2 braids and a blue-gray headband up in the tree over my face staring at me. I knew I was dreaming, but I couldn't move or wake up. I was only able to move when Josh on the other side of the shelter yelled and sat up. I thought it was just a horrible dream until I talked to Jess about the rain last night. She admitted to me that she hadn't been worried about rain, but that she had been dead asleep when she felt somebody reach into her sleeping bag and shove her head to the side. She panicked and lay there and pretended like she was sleeping, but then knelt over her face for a few minutes. She said she was terrified to open her eyes. When she felt them leave, she waited for a few minutes and then woke everyone up. I was wondering why she slept in the middle of everyone. That would make sense. I was quiet. Katie spoke again. Before breakfast, I asked Josh why he yelled and sat up. I was grateful he did, but curious as to why. He told me that he had a horrible nightmare about a little Native American girl. And when he thought he woke up, he saw her running at him. He yelled and she jumped over his head and took off. That's when he really woke up and sat up. He was surprised I heard him yell. He thought he was still asleep at that point and he dreamed the yelling part. I didn't tell Jess or Josh what happened to me, and I didn't tell them about each other. But at breakfast, Will told us about his horrible dream about a little girl dying in that cabin when it burned down. We all freaked out. It's all we've been talking about today. Half of the group didn't believe us, and Carol Sue, the loud, annoying one, has told everyone that we're just trying to haze the new guys. Even Josh, who is a new guy, is in on it, apparently. And then the sweat lodge thing happened. With what you just told me, I don't think any of us were dreaming. We were quiet for a long time. I think we should move camp down the road tomorrow, I finally said. I'll clean up this mess in the morning. Katie just nodded and stood up. Oh, and Katie, it's probably a good idea for everyone to be under the shelter to sleep tonight. And also maybe don't light another fire. I'm guessing the one at your group site is out too. She sighed tiredly and walked off into the dark. I just sat there for a while and slowly made my way back to the truck. I didn't feel like anyone was watching me anymore. But that didn't stop me from sleeping in the cab with the doors locked for the rest of the week. Nick and Jeff Ryan hadn't seen their fiancés in 2 weeks. All 4 of them were field staff, and typically they worked separate groups on the same rotation, so that they would all be out of the field for their off-week together. Nick and V were getting married in March, and Jeff, Ryan, and Sarah were thinking sometime midsummer, though they hadn't set a date yet. The girls had decided that they were going to work a triple, and then take a week off to go to Hawaii for 3 weeks. Which, according to the Weird Trails schedule, where you typically only work every other week, makes sense. Anyway, the guys who weren't invited on the girls' trip knew that they weren't going to see the girls for at least a month, and they already hadn't seen them for 2 weeks, so they decided that they were going to go out and surprise the ladies, who were both in the girls' group. And what better day to go than Valentine's Day? They knew they could get in trouble with the directors if they were caught out visiting a group without an official reason to be there, so they bribed the water guy to call in sick, and to tell the field directors that they had already asked Nick to cover for him. No one would think anything of Jeff Ryan showing up in the field with Nick. They had grown up together, been missionary companions in Los Angeles together, and had started in the same training group together right after the company had opened up. They were always together. Seeing Nick in the field without Jeff Ryan would have been more suspicious. They left early in the morning in Nick's Jeep, and headed out to Waterdrop for the 4 groups before they started the day's hike. It was unseasonably warm from early February, which meant that instead of dealing with the cold or even snow, they had to somehow navigate the muddy dirt trails on the front side of the Sheeprock mountain range. It took them much longer to navigate the trails than usual, because they would sink every couple hundred yards and have to use the winch to pull the Jeep along until they could drive it again. The girls were camped out in East Government Creek, up near where the road ended. The plan for them that day was to drop out of the canyon a little ways onto the flats and hike across country to North Pine Canyon. By the time the 2 guys had finished getting everyone's water in place and relaying that information to backup, it was nearly 3 in the afternoon. Neither of the guys wanted to go into East Government, and not just because the road was likely to be a nightmare. No, they had recently been to East Government with their own group of kids, and Jessica. While camped there, they had been visited by what they described to me as a mountain ogre. They had hiked over the saddle from West Government to the eastern side of the mountain range, and had arrived at night at the base of Red Pine Mountain about halfway down East Government Canyon, where they started to set up camp. They had only been there a few minutes, less than 2 minutes, Nick said, when they heard a noise. He had just undone and dropped his backpack, when from a little ways off in the juniper trees down the valley from them came the sound of branches snapping and rocks scraping. The kids didn't notice at first, but after a minute it became clear that the noise was getting louder and coming right for them, and the kids all started to get quiet and listen. Jeff Ryan said that at first he assumed it was some rancher's cow that, for whatever reason, was still out there in late December. Pretty soon, though, it became clear, at least from the sound, that it was bigger than a cow. The boys and Jessica all kind of huddled up listening to the noise, and when it sounded really close, Nick let out a whoop to hopefully let the horse or elk or moose, which he assumed it to be, know they were there. The animal stopped in the trees and went silent. The whole group also went silent. After several intense minutes of no sound, the group slowly and quietly started setting up camp. Nick did a quick little scouting mission into the trees once the rest of the group was busy, but saw nothing. It was freezing cold and snowy, but at least the moon was up and getting higher, so the surrounding hills were steadily becoming more and more visible, especially in the reflected light from the snow. Once the camp was up and they had a fire going and dinner was cooking, they all started to relax a little. The noise had likely been an elk coming to see who was invading its home for the night. When they went to bed, they were exhausted but in good spirits. We tend to go to bed early in the wintertime on the trail, so think like 9 p.m. Nick said that an hour after going to bed, he heard a chirping sound. It wasn't loud enough to wake the boys, but it was close by, and not any bird or insect he had ever heard. It was like a marmot, but deeper. Jessica and Jeff Ryan both sat straight up, listening at the same time Nick did. Nick signaled Jessica to wait with the boys, and he and Jeff Ryan silently slipped out of their sleeping bags and did up their boots and overboots. Nick exited the shelter on one side and Jeff Ryan squeezed out the other. They met up under a large pine tree out on the moonlit clearing their camp was in, and just watched and listened. The chirping sound had stopped, and they waited there so long Nick said he felt like he started to freeze solid. Presently the crashing noise in the bushes started up again, heading back down the canyon the way it had come. This time, however, the guys could see the trees moving and shaking as the thing passed. Whatever it was huge, as tall as a moose maybe. They followed as quietly as they could, but their boots crunched on the icy snow. It was only about a minute before they passed a thicket of pine and juniper where it seemed like it had been waiting. The guy said the smell was horrendous, like a sewer with a large dead animal stewing in the same pot on a hot day in July. Gagging, they sped up. It was only another 30 or 40 seconds before they came out of the trees into another little clearing. The thing wasn't running, so as they entered the open space on one side, they caught a glimpse of a huge hair-covered thing on 2 legs stalk out of the clearing into the trees on the other side. Jeff Ryan said later that the hardest thing that he ever did in his life was in that moment to control his bladder and take the next step. Nick was already halfway across the clearing by the time Jeff Ryan moved. Nick said that most of the crashing noise was because the thing was stepping right on top of juniper and sagebrush. It wasn't making a straight line, rather it was sort of gently hopping from bush to bush, stomping some of them flat if they were smaller and breaking branches or occasionally not, coming to rest briefly a foot or 2 off the ground in a tree before hopping on to the next brush. They followed as close as they dared, and eventually they got a little higher on a south-facing hill, at the base of Red Pine. They were maybe half a mile from camp at this point. Here, large swaths of exposed boulders and bedrock poked up from the ground, and the snow had all been blown or melted away. At this point, the thing turned fully around and glared at them. Nick said it was at least 11 foot tall. Jeff Ryan said it was 14 foot tall, but they both agreed that it was enormous. They froze in place instantly. It had long hair all over its body, nothing like a bear or a big cat, but longer and finer like a human. It stood like an ape with a human posture and stared them down for a few long seconds. They both thought they were dead. Then it turned and ran. Later on, they showed me where they had stopped and where it had stood. Nick had marked the spot with a large pile of rocks to be sure he could find it again in the morning. From where it had stopped to the base of the cliffs, halfway up Red Pine, was a distance of several hundred yards of steep brush-covered mountainside. Nick said they watched it in the bright moonlight cover the distance in a matter of moments. When it reached the cliff, it didn't even slow down. It just jumped and grabbed on, pulling itself up, and then jumped again 3 or 4 times, and it was gone, out of sight. They took a few moments to process what they had seen, and to mark the spot so they could come back and look for tracks. And then they went back to camp and climbed in bed after telling Jessica the whole story. None of them slept. The next day, Nick and Jessica followed their tracks from the camp up to the hill where it took off. There were no clear tracks from the creature anywhere. Some small depressions or indentations in the snow next to crushed brush here and there, but not a single recognizable track. There was, however, a lingering scent of rot beneath the trees where it had been stood still for several hours watching them. This episode's still fresh in their minds. They opted not to drive up into East Government to try to meet up with the girls' group and their respective girlfriends. They would try to intercept them on their hike over to North Pine instead, or at worst, meet them late at night after they arrived in their new camp. Their last drop had been up near the Pony Express Road, and the quickest way to get to the girls' group site was to go through Vernon on the highway, and then turn up off near the reservoir and pick their way up the trails to the water drop. And indeed, that's how they had dropped their water off earlier in the day, If they did that, however, they were sure to miss him on their hike. Their more sure option was to take the Sheeprock Front Road, a small dirt two-track that wound along the base of the foothills that would be quite a bit slower in the mud, but would also give them the highest chance of running into the girls' group and surprising their girlfriends. Root decided they took off. It was slow, but it wasn't as muddy as it had been on the smaller roads, and they made pretty good time. Neither of them had driven this particular route from this direction before, and the roads were a little bit of a maze, crisscrossing and going every which way, and they weren't always well marked. When they had gone nearly the length of the valley, and thought they were approaching the road that would take them up on North Pine, they spotted signs that a group of kids had walked out of the sage and gone up the road to the right. They followed the tracks a ways up the road into a wide ravine that in the dimming twilight Jeff Ryan suddenly realized was North Oak Brush, 2 canyons up from North Pine in the wrong direction. No sooner had they realized that they were in the wrong place than the tracks they had been following veered into the sagebrush again, heading more in the direction the girls would be camped. Nick stopped the jeep. They discussed and decided to get out and try and track the group they had been following on foot. Maybe they were close. They grabbed the flowers and sandwiches. Normal food is a way better present than just about anything else when you've been on the trail a few weeks. They had brought for their girlfriends. They followed the trampled, muddy path for a few hundred yards and came to an open, grassy field with a shallow, dry stream bed running across it. The tracks led up to the edge of the stream bed and stopped. They just ended like the whole group just got picked up by a helicopter, or aliens. As they stood there contemplating the muddy ground, the guys heard a quiet noise from across the stream. There, a ways away in the gloom, was one of the students from the girls' group. She was small, with dark hair, facing away from them. Was that Allison? Where were the other girls? Where was her backpack? Nick called out to her, waving his arms. "Hey! Hello?" She turned. It was not Allison. It was a girl they had never seen before, but who had been described to them in detail by several of the other staff. Small and Native American with 2 long braids and a bluish-gray headband, in a nondescript pioneer-era dress. For a moment she looked in their direction with her captivating and terrifyingly intense glare. Then she started running directly at them. They panicked and took off back down the muddy trail through the sage. Jeff Ryan was ahead of Nick, and had almost made it half the distance back to the jeep, when he tripped and rolled into the little ditch between 2 large sage bushes. Nick passed him in a blur, and the girl followed close behind. She stepped in a clear area between the sage and just a few feet in front of Jeff Ryan's face. She wore no shoes or moccasins, and her passing left almost no trace of a print on the muddy ground. Just the faintest hint of a depression that soon vanished. What Jeff Ryan remembered most was the horrible numbing coldness that came over him as she neared, but then faded just as quickly as she passed by. By the time Nick got to the jeep and turned around to look for Jeff Ryan or the ghost girl, she was gone. Jeff Ryan came limping out of the sage, carrying a backpack of squashed sandwiches and flowers a moment later, and they climbed in the jeep and sped off. They eventually found their girlfriends and delivered their gifts, which I'm sure were much appreciated, even if some of them were a little squashed. I wasn't told this story until about 6 months after it happened, and I had to hear about it from another staff member and ask them to tell me what happened. They told me, but I could tell that this experience bothered them even more than the mountain ogre had. It just proves my point that it's always better to do the chasing when something crazy is happening than to be the one getting chased. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 224. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. A little bit of a shout out there for the author of story number 1, Jukes for Spooks. That's Jukes number 4 Spooks. Their handle on Reddit there. Thank you very kindly for letting me use your story, and also a thank you to the author of the final story there. Very kindly let me use the original story as was published, but they also sent me essentially almost another chunk, nearly the same length, of additional information. And that was the second part with the folks trying to track down their girlfriends, encountering the ogre, and then meeting the little girl again. Very much appreciated. We always like to have the complete story when possible. Okay, well, sunny weather, so I can hear people out having fun and not social distancing. But fine, okay. Vaccinations are rolling out. Hopefully they roll out a bit quicker. That's, yep. I take it I'll get a letter telling me when I'm eligible. Hope it's soon. I've heard August at the latest, so I'll probably be in the August batch. Well, a few months before I can lick random strangers again. Okay, and with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.